I just wanted to introduce myself, Austin Williams. I'm the director of the Future Cities Project, and we run debates and conversations, and we write on a variety of topics about the city. And this one is very clearly addressing that, although the topic itself is probably going to look at race and history and more broadly, but it's about public and civic space. Let's give you a brief introduction to the topic, because June, when it all kicked off, is a long time ago in many people's memories. The 7th of June, the statue of Edward Colston came down and thrown in the harbour, and now it's been put into the Bristol Museum. Then Colston Hall had its name removed, then the local school had it removed, and then the shopping centre had it removed. So there's this kind of nationwide flurry of statue toppling took place, defacing historic monuments, and targeting statues, from Winston Churchill in London to Robert the Bruce in Scotland, from Queen Victoria in Leeds to Thomas Picton, the latest one in Cardiff. Then we had this kind of strange sight of statue defenders, people springing up to protect sculptures, from Baden-Powell to the Cenotaph in Glasgow. I'm getting some feedback on my introduction. Is everybody okay? Yes?
Yeah, it's okay.
Okay. So you have this kind of strange kind of standoff between two groups. Racist organisations threatened to pull down Nelson Mandela, and then Marc Quinn erected the statue of Reid in Bristol until the mayor removed that statue for breaching planning conditions. So it's a good time to ask what the hell is going on, really. That's really what this talk is about, what is happening. And in some ways, even though Rishi Sunak has just denied it, there was this campaign to have Gandhi's portrait on a commemorative coin to represent his influence on black people in public life, while at the same time there's an equal and opposite petition to get Gandhi's statue removed from Leicester because of some of the things he said about black people in South Africa 120 years ago. And now we have councils across the country carrying out audits of statues of places and buildings which may have a relationship to the colonial past. But there doesn't seem, at least to me, we can have a conversation about it, any real coherent strategy. So what I have are a couple of questions for the panel and for the audience more broadly. You can ignore these or deal with them as you will. Does this attack on statues help us understand history, or does it kind of erase a sense of history? And I know Professor Catter already disagrees with me on even asking that question in the way I have, so we can have a bit of a row about that one. Who's in control of what's happening, if anybody? You know, is this an anarchic kind of framework, or is there an end point? Does the statue destruction represent the force of like an unruly mob or enlightened anti-racists? Are the defenders of statues by comparison reactionary racists, or are they liberals, conservationists? What is the rule of law in all this conversation? Or is it a free-for-all? And I suppose finally for me, where is the democratic conversation in all this? After all, this is about the appearance and life within the public square. So where is the national conversation about it? So anyway, those are my questions. We got a terrific panel to address these. Let me introduce Patrick. If Patrick is here, that would be fantastic. If not, we'll take him when he comes in. But we have Patrick Vernon, who's a social commentator and founder of 100 Great Black Britons, a book coming out in October, and he's the creator of a board game. I wanted to meet him just because I've never met the inventor of a board game, called Every Generation Game Windrush Edition. His list of positions and activities are far too numerous to mention. I think we're putting up some details of the speakers on the chat thing now. He's currently crowdfunding a statue to commemorate Windrush campaigner Paulette Wilson in Wolverhampton. Then we have, this is the order in which I will speak. Next we'll have Ike IJ, who's an architect and critic for Building Magazine. He's the director of London Architecture Works and author of Designing London, Understanding the Character of the City. And he wrote a very powerful article in the Telegraph on this and similar matters about Black Lives Matter. Third up, we have Professor Pippa Catter, who's Professor of History and Politics at Westminster University, and she's the founder of National Identities Journal. She's an expert on many things, including British political, diplomatic, and constitutional history, and she was the editor of the Harold Macmillan Diaries, long after he died, I hasten to add. She's the chair of the George Lansbury Memorial Trust, and also has a list of affiliations as long as your arm. Again, you can check them out on the links. who's currently completed, which you can, I have a bad internet at this moment. She's currently completed her PhD at the University of Manchester on cultural policy and political intervention in post-conflict Northern Ireland. She's the co-founder of the Liverpool Salon debating forum, and she's the former director of Belfast Exposed, internationally renowned contemporary photography gallery. As I say, I'm Austin Williams from the Future Cities Project, and I'm delighted to be hosting and chairing this event. So that's where we're at. I would now like to introduce Patrick. Yes, Patrick, good man, you're there. You gave me heart palpitations for a second, but
about that.
I hope you heard. Okay, I hope you heard your groundbreaking, earth-shattering introduction there.
I heard that. Yeah.
Good man, good man. Okay, well, look, so we have 4 or 5 minutes apiece. If you just want to launch into your little introduction, Patrick, and then we'll.
Sure. Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah. My 4 or 5 minutes is more about clarification than trying to make a case, to be quite honest. So clarification number 1, I think it's quite important. When we have these debates about memorialisation and statues, the emotions get carried away in these debates and we don't look at the facts and the evidence. So yes, Colston statue has been removed and I actually supported that. I know, and then for many years in Bristol, there have been a campaign and debates for its removal. And I've always equated the removal of Colston statue to the, similar to the Berlin Wall being coming down in 1989, basically. It was, so it was on one level act of liberation, but at the same time, we have to recognize that we can't do this for all statues. So if you look at Winston Churchill statue, I'm not a complete fan of Winston Churchill, but I've actually benefited from the Winston Churchill Foundation, of the Travel Awards, and many people of colour have benefited from them for the last 30, 40 years of the legacy of Winston Churchill, travelling around the world, exploring subjects dear to them, which in my case, I went to the Caribbean, America to find more about issues around art, culture and mental health well-being, basically. And more recently, the Winston Churchill Foundation have given me a small grant to develop a website linked to COVID-19 as part of that community response. But I think we have to make for me, in terms of, if we were to have a very hard rule about any memorial or statue in Britain which offended people, I think there'd be hardly any statues or memorials in Britain at all, basically. We'd probably spend the next 20 years, even longer, removing every single statue. So we have to be pragmatic and realistic. What statues are contested and what statues need clarification, etc. And I think for me, there's a very clear line. Yes, all statespeople are flawed. Flawed. Everyone, from Gandhi, even Martin Luther King had his flaws. Everyone has their flaws. But I think there's a fundamental difference between someone like Colston and a number of people who were directly involved in the transatlantic slave trade. I think, personally speaking, those particular memorials should be removed, because the question is, if we had memorials in Britain of people who were involved in the Holocaust, automatically people would say, that's outrageous. Why are we having memorials connected with the Holocaust? Because if you go to Germany, you will never see any memorials connected with the Holocaust, anyone advocating the Third Reich, fascism, or even defending the Holocaust in Germany. But yet in Britain, when it comes to the issue of the transatlantic slave trade, it seems to be different. This was a Holocaust which had impact on tens of millions of people of African descent, my ancestors, over a long period of time. And we see it, the Black community and other communities see that as the equivalent of the Holocaust. And yet this country has always been in denial of that. And I think this is an opportunity to reflect on this big issue of restorative justice. So I think any slave trader or anyone who had direct financial benefits from the slave trade, those memorials should be removed. Recently, I live in Hackney, and the Jeffrey Museum, or now it's called the Museum of the Home, they, as part of the whole context around Black Lives Matter, they had a consultation with the community about Sir Jeffrey. He was involved in the slave trade, and the museum has always been there, and and the trustee decided to have a process to find out what they should do. Should they remove the statue? Should they change the name? Basically. And what was quite clear, that the online response and the formal response from Hackney Council said, we want you to remove the memorial, that statue. But the trustees, which have no proper representation of the community in Hackney, or even of London, on that board, decided that they defended to keep that statue, and they said this is because they're still committed to anti-racism and Black Lives Matter, which is a bit of a joke, to be quite honest. And so, you know, and so there's still an ongoing campaign for the Jeffrey Museum to reconsider their thoughts as well. So I think so to me, I've got a very clear line of, you know, we can't get rid of all memorials, but certain memorials are definitely more offensive than others. I've been involved in a campaign with a close friend and activist friend of mine, Zahira Zari. She's a Conservative Party activist. I'm a Labour Party activist. And we joined forces together probably about 2 years ago, making the case to the Bank of England around BME representation and banknotes. And we've joined forces. She was supporting Noah Khan, well-known, respected heroine of World War II. I was supporting Mary Seacole, heroine of the Crimean War, to make the case around representation and gender. Because apart from the Queen, there's hardly any female representation on banknotes, apart from recently with Jane Austen, and that was another campaign that was done some years recently. So essentially, we were making a case, and it's great that Alan Turning was chosen for the £50 note, but it raised a fundamental issue regarding representation in the context of COVID, Black Lives Matter, and equality in general. And luckily, we've got support of the Chancellor of the Exchequer regarding our campaign. But I think this, just to clarify for facts to the audience, he's not supporting Gandhi, by the way. He's supporting the concept of BME representation in coins where people have contributed to Britain. Because if we look at the criteria of the Bank of England or the Royal Mint, it's very clear it's about contributions to Britain, not just internationally. Gandhi was obviously did play a key role around the independence of leading the independence of India, etc. But we're talking about the contribution of Britain, and that was one of the reasons why I did my campaign 17 years ago, called 100 Great Black Britons, to celebrate 2,000 years of Black presence in Britain. But unfortunately, everyone is assuming that we're supporting to have Gandhi on a coin note. I mean, that was the previous Chancellor, Javid, who wanted that, but the current Chancellor has not said or indicated at all. So just to clarify, we want to have a woman of colour on any coins in the future. I think that's important. Noah Khan, Mary Seacole, and there's a whole range of women that we should select on that point. And the final point I want to make is it's about inclusion, it's about intersectionality. And there are some memorials and statues which in the 21st century, particularly around those involved in atrocities or benefited from atrocities, should not be considered for future generations.
Very good, Patrick. It's very kind of you, and nicely on time. Can I just quickly ask one quick question in terms of what you just said? And I think the Holocaust conversation is for the broader panel. But how do you differentiate the statue of Jeffrey from the name of Jeffrey Museum? And do you differentiate Mary Seacole from the Crimean War? How do you make those separations?
Well, I mean, it's very simple. Mary Seacole, from her own volition, volunteered to have and she had a hospital in Balaclava in Turkey. Same time as also Florence Nightingale was there. So she, you know, basically she was making an effort. I mean, didn't benefit from the slave trade. She was not a slave trader, whereas, you know, so there's a fundamental difference there. So I'm not quite sure what the comparison you're trying to make. Well,
the Imperial War, that's what I was trying to say. But look, I'm just throwing that in.
I mean,
that's fine.
The final point where people have argued about Napoleon, about Nelson, about his, obviously Nelson was a sailor, he wasn't involved in trading. His best mates were slave traders, and some people think we should remove Nelson Column. I don't agree with that, because actually if you look at Nelson Column, it celebrates black sailors, because a third of his sailors were actually Africans. So I think we should acknowledge that too as well.
Okay, good. And we know where you're coming from. Okay, Patrick, that was excellent kickoff. Thank you very much for that. Next up, Ike, can we take you, please?
Hello. All right. Hello. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for coming. Thanks to you, Austin, for organising this. Right, so basically the question is, does removing statues kickstart a new era of history or merely erase valuable lessons from the past? Now, I'm going to say, with most cases, apart from a few exceptions, which I'll go into later, that I do not agree with removing statues from the past for a number of reasons, which I'll go into now. Personally, I think it's total intellectual lunacy to judge history by contemporary standards. Societies change and evolve all the time, and in the same way we wouldn't charge someone for the sins his father committed, I don't think we should be desecrating our public realm for crimes committed generations ago. Now, this, of course, it doesn't mean that I'd be happy to see statues of anybody, such as Hitler, for instance, but a difference between, I know we've touched on the Holocaust, someone like Hitler and someone like Colston is because outside Germany, Hitler was almost universally condemned at the time, whereas Colston wasn't. I'm not justifying slavery, it's just a difference in perspective. Another reason why I'm against generally removing statues is because it doesn't actually change the past, all it does is alter the present. It's also, ironically, a form of cultural whitewashing that essentially makes us feel better about ourselves, but doesn't really give us a deeper understanding about the past or our relationship to it. I'm also worried because this statue kind of campaign we're having now at the moment is kind of a tip of the iceberg. Everywhere we're seeing a kind of puritanical cultural purge, which makes us think that everything from Tom and Jerry to Gone with the Wind is bad. To me, it's a form of kind of, it's replacing a historic form of intolerance with a contemporary one. And I think all that's bound to do is increase tension and resentment and potentially lead to failure and unrest. And for instance, the founder of the Guardian newspaper was vehemently against Lincoln's abolition of slavery. Now, that doesn't mean I want to see the woke delight that is the Guardian abolished. These things happen and they change. Another reason why I'm against it is because expecting historic figures to be either good or evil is deeply immature, in my opinion, and it says more about our intellectual naivety as a society than it does about the individual concerned. I mean, as Patrick pointed out, people are flawed. Yes, Winston Churchill had his flaws, but so did a whole range of historical figures, ranging from Caravaggio, who committed murder, even to one of my heroes, Martin Luther King, who's been all kinds of suspicions and theories about extramarital affairs potentially he may have got up to. Essentially, no figure is black or white, and were we to measure every historic figure by these puritanical standards we're trying to impose now, we'd virtually have no statues left. Another reason I'm against it is, rather than destroying statues, why don't we erect new ones of figures we'd like to see instead? I'm fully behind Patrick's campaign to erect a statue of Paul A. Wilson. I think that's far more in keeping with the kind of thing we should be doing. And there's probably a whole host of figures from all different colours and backgrounds who haven't been commemorated in this way, who deserve to be. And not only could kind of selecting who we commemorate and who we build statues of, not only could it galvanise public debate, but it could be a far more positive and creative way to atone for the sins of the past. Another reason I'm against this is because public space happens to be one of my hobby horses. I've written about it in my book extensively. I'm still one of the probably proudest of all my projects to have worked on the part pedestrianisation of Trafalgar Square. Now, I vehemently believe that public spaces should be an expression of democracy and should encapsulate a collective shared sense of citizenship. They should also say something about our civic identity. And history, good or bad, is an integral part of that identity. Now, London examples, very much a good example of this, because London has very deep libertarian instincts that run historically through the city's development, and the urban fabric of a city like London is far more a result of private individual enterprise than it is about the kind of unilateral imposition of a grand plan or a king's vision, as we see in places like Paris or Rome. So, though I agree, as I said earlier, I think it's pointless to judge history by our standards. If we do insist on doing that, then let's do it democratically and by popular or public consent, and not do it by a braying mob. Which brings me on to Edward Colston. Obviously, it was a mob that removed the statue in Bristol. Obviously, I said I don't disagree with it, but if that statue had been removed by a referendum or some other means of popular local consent within the city, that would have been fine by me. Anarchist mobs should not do the work of local authorities. Two final points to end on. Another reason I'm against this is because removing statues is also, it's quite a trite gesture. It's the equivalent of a black square on Instagram that makes people feel better about themselves while leaving the real injustices that are happening now, not 300 years ago, alone to fester. Of all the people who dragged the Colston statue down, I suspect that not one of them has done anything to protest against the estimated 40 million, mainly Black and Asian slaves who are estimated to be in indentured servitude today. And just finally, just to conclude, while obviously I abhor racism, as all intelligent people do, I disagree profoundly with the Black Lives Matter agenda, and I utterly resist its attempts to paint me and every other Black person as a perpetual oppressed victim. I mean, strangely, I don't need Black Lives Matter or Gary Lineker to tell me that my life matters, because I already know it matters. And like the vast majority of people, I'm an intelligent human being, and I'm not a bigoted psychopath who would maybe think that a Black life doesn't matter. That said, even though I don't agree with their agenda, or certainly the way they're doing it, I have full respect for the Black Lives the Black Lives Matters movement's right to protest peacefully and democratically. That should be enshrined and protected, and they have every right to have their message heard. My issue, what I object to, is their private political agenda being used to redefine my communal public space.
Great, thank you very much, Ike. There's a lot for everybody to come back on there, but let me just ask you one question myself, which is your opening, since you had like a 10 bullet point definition as to why you disagree with the proposition. You said that if it was condemned universally and at the time, that was like one of your parameters. Are you suggesting that maybe changing our minds about the value and the worth of statues is not part of your criteria? Therefore, we stick them up and we have to live with it.
Changing mind, no, that's it. Changing minds is fine. I think that's fine, but I just think mine should be changed by a democratic process. I believe in democracy. I'm a libertarian. I don't want to impose my will on anybody else. As I've said, I think it's insane to judge the past by the present. But if people do want to do that, let's do it. Let's change opinions by all means. Let's remove statues, but let's just make sure it's done democratically and not by an anarchistic braying mob who take it upon themselves to represent everybody when they don't.
Okay. Interesting rhetorical flourishes you have there. Thank you. Just to stir up the rest of the panel. Speaking of which, thank you very much, Ike. That's very, very kind of you. Next up, Pippa, if you are game and ready, that would be good to hear your 4 or 5 minutes worth. Can we unmute you 1 second?
Okay. Right. Thank you. Well, welcome from the token historian on the panel, because everyone's talking about history, so maybe I can actually engage with it. Though having, from an informed perspective, having heard what Ike said about tokenism and not overestimating the importance of statues, I would agree with that part of what he said, if not if everything else. It seems to me rather more important to effectively audit the number of buildings which are like Grenfell Tower than audit the number of statues we have. For many people, most of the time, unless something like Colston comes up, statues are white noise in stone. They don't notice them, and they're not necessarily huge parts of the public, hugely important parts of the public realm. They're certainly not how people understand history. And so to talk about them as being central to history is deeply misleading. This is for a number of reasons. One is that most of the statues in the UK come from the Victorian era. We therefore are talking about an extremely limited sample of representation of the past. Secondly, those statues were provided by Victorians to celebrate what they wanted to emphasise, and frequently they weren't provided democratically at all. Thirdly, it is logically impossible to cancel the past anyway. The past is past. We can't even recapture it. Historians construct narratives about the past based on what survives from it, one of which, but only one of which, is statues. And all of those survivals have to be interpreted in terms of what they actually reveal. So if we're talking about cancelling anything, we might be talking about cancelling representations of the past. But statues usually aren't even that. So if we take the Colston statue, for instance, it was put up in 1895. That's only 174 years after Colston died. It was largely funded by the bodies that benefited from his philanthropy, and it was established to celebrate that philanthropy. In other words, it represented a one-sided view of his career, not the murkier side of his life, which resulted in the deaths of thousands of people. Indeed, one might argue that the celebration of Colston's philanthropy was effectively serving to cancel, or I would prefer to use the term erase, that murkier side of his history. It's a bit like the ongoing project of building luxury hotels on St. Lucia, on the site of former slave pens, which is going on at the moment. An even more physical form of erasure. Statues and slave pens, in and of themselves, are not history. As I said earlier, history is a narrative about the past constructed from the residues that we have from that. They cannot recapture the experiences of their former inmates or the lives that they depict. They don't even necessarily convey the full story. I mean, leave aside Colston, there is a phenomenon called the Matilda effect, which is about the way in which the contribution of women is frequently erased from history, and men end up being celebrated instead. Look at the number of Nobel Prizes given to men as opposed to women. Look at the fact that we only have less than 3% of statues in Britain which represent women, once you leave aside the ones of royal women. Indeed, we've only seen belated recognition of figures like Rosalind Franklin, who contributed to the development of the discovery of DNA. More recently, 2014, a statue was erected to her in Chicago, not in her native Britain. Like the slave pens then, these statues and commemorations don't necessarily reflect the past. They can also be moved and built on and torn down and vandalized, not just by mobs, as we heard from the previous speaker, but also by officialdom. The end of empire may have seen symbols of power, such as Victorian statues, pulled down and replaced, but the British in their turn were quite capable of doing the same when they conquered other people's empires, most notably the destruction of much of Delhi and the erection of army barracks in the remains of the Red Fort, the Palace of the Mughals, after 1857. In that instance, the erasure of the past was a deliberate political act by the British in order to erase a Mughal past. These acts change the site we interact with. Colston's statue represented him through the lens of what those who fundraised for John Cassidy's representation of him in 1895 wanted to celebrate. As in that instance, the erection of such memorials is frequently not something which has been democratic, but reflects elite views of what they want to use public space to celebrate. In his instance, they wanted to celebrate what was seen, ironically enough, as an exemplary life. Removing his statue does not remove him from the historical record, but removes a particular Victorian reading of him. There are plenty of other memorials to Colston, although obviously these are gradually being questioned as well. But the senior side of his life has not been represented yet. The nearest we have to that is the temporary installation of Cara Walker's Fons Americanus in the Tate Modern, which has representation of drowning slaves in the Atlantic and so on. And that's a temporary backsweep of protest against the chorus of imperial statues around Britain. There is, however, arguably a place where people who were responsible for mass murder are celebrated and can enjoy a ghoulish notoriety. It's called the London Dungeon. So you're not erasing these people. There are perhaps more appropriate places to recall them. Finally, I want to turn to the reference to how should we democratically engage with these things. As I say, most of the things we have in the public realm were not erected through democratic consent. Therefore, I would say that we not only need to have votes on new statues, as it were, but we also ought to think in terms of sunset clauses, in which we review the things which clutter our public realm and act within it as residues of what the past thought, or what people in the past thought was important, but which may not really speak to us.
Very good. Like a statute of limitations on statutes, statute of limitations, perhaps. Very, very nice, Pippa. Thank you very much. Can I just quickly ask you just to clarify one thing, because I think you've raised an awful lot of issues there. In terms of, you mentioned buildings as well, and it's interesting that obviously one builds buildings without real democratic engagement, albeit there's a planning process and all the rest of it. But we build buildings. But the act of construction versus the act of demolition, these have kind of positive and negative connotations, don't they? So the act of tearing something down, where we tear down buildings, would be seen in whichever world in which we live, would be seen as an act of destruction. So do you see the kind of negative connotation between taking the statue down, regardless of how you might see the individual figure himself or herself?
I think there's a constant process of renewal. I mean, that's what cities are. Cities are constantly being renewed. In the course of the post-war era, lots of statues have been moved around in this country. Lots of statues have been removed, put into storage, and so on. You think about the building wave of the 1960s, which sees exactly that kind of process going on through officialdom, as you say, without democratic consent to a larger extent. Secondly, there's always the problem of that kind of erasure going on. You think of some stately homes in this country, picking up on what Patrick said about let's get rid of anything which has any connections to slavery. You can't do that. I mean, would you take down Warwick Castle because it's got connections to slavery? In creating the lawns around Warwick Castle, Capability Brown was using revenue from, garnered from slavery and removing lots of cottages of ordinary common people of this country because they spoiled the view. I mean, so where do you start and where do you stop on that? What I'm saying is that we need to recognise that there is this constant renewal process, and that we as people are constantly in a dialogic relationship to the past. It is not that the past is static, it is that we have to engage with it now, in the present.
Thank you very much indeed, Pippa. That's very nice rounding up and summing up much better than I had put words into your mouth. Okay, finally we have Pauline Hadaway.
Hi.
You are there.
Yeah.
Hi, Paul.
Thank you. Thanks. I'd like to follow on, I think, from that last point that Pippa made, really. Let me start on the 14th of July, 1789, when the citizens of Paris stormed the Bastille, the hated symbol of despotism of France's ancien regime. And within 2 days of its fall, the National Assembly ordered that the prison be razed to the ground so the people of France might rejoice that grass grew where the Bastille stood. And in 1985, the statue of Queen Victoria that once graced the entrance to the Irish Parliament in Dublin was retrieved from a barn in a farm in County Meath, Ireland, and shipped off to Australia, where it was relocated to a public square to provide a decorative focal point and meeting place in Sydney. And in June 2020, the University of Liverpool agreed to rename one of its halls of residence, which is just down the road from where we live, as a demonstration of solidarity to and a rejection of Black oppression. And the decision to remove William Gladstone's name from this building followed a 3-year campaign which had highlighted his familial connection to the transatlantic slave trade and advocacy for the reparation of slave owners after abolition. And these 3 monuments to the past really show 3 very different reckonings with history. And I think they invite the question, what does the removal and renaming of monuments mean politically? And I think we can only begin to answer that by thinking about their meaning in history. In the midst of social upheaval, political struggle, and as old regimes collapse, monuments and statues are frequently subjected to all kinds of indignities. So the Bastille prison was symbolic of the old regime that had been overthrown, and the decision by the new National Assembly to raise it down was taken in the name of the new Republic. And Queen Victoria, having survived Ireland's War of Independence, was removed in 1947, at the moment that Ireland repudiated its Dominion status and laid claim to the status of an independent republic. And Victoria was disposed of in the same way that thousands of statues and street names honouring imperial viceroys and monarchs had been consigned to history, almost as collateral damage of the great mass movement of decolonisation. But I think the renaming of the Gladstone building is very different. And I think it's neither a product or even a byproduct, well, clearly it's not, of revolutionary change or social transformation. It's actually the continuation of a campus culture war. And I think that this is evident in its transactional character and in the limited nature of its demands, and at the way that the wrongs of history become integrated and neutralized within managerial frameworks of reconciliation and recognition, where both sides agree to work in dialogue to choose an appropriate alternative name. And I think the problem with the renaming that's going on now is that the rational aspirations, which the speakers have talked about, people have talked about, their radical aspirations, actually fail because they're out of kilter with the political moment. And I've got 3 problems I want to raise with them. First of all, the way that national governments and public authorities actually use the memorialization of historical crimes as vehicles for performing symbolic gestures of recognition, reconciliation, and repentance. And that's very much, I can talk about that in terms of my own research in Northern Ireland. But rather than subverting moral legitimacy or challenging power, public figures and politicians express their shame on our behalf as a way of winning accolades, enhancing their self-image, and legitimating the political status quo. Second problem, and it's been talked about by some of the speakers here, and I'll add to it. The Austrian writer Robert Musil, writing about monuments in 1927, observed that there is nothing more invisible to the human eye than a monument, whose ultimate fate in the modern city is to be precipitated into the ocean of oblivion. And during the 20th century, in the former imperial capitals of Europe, we saw a shift in public taste away from the heroic figurative statues of earlier periods towards simpler, more abstract forms of statuary and memorial that invited reflection on the tragic heroism of anonymous men and women, and after 1945 in particular, on the meaninglessness of war. And yet here we are in late modernity, waking up again to these anachronistic forms of statuary that litter our streets. And we've given them an unmerited political meaning and agency, which we use really to define new in-groups and out-groups and to generate and negate new political enemies. And I think that's a very retrograde use of public memorializing. And finally, I think I agree with a number of people who've talked about the way that, the whitewashing of history. And I think the reawakening of interest in these outmoded relics of defunct regimes does not represent a reclamation of history. In fact, the campaign to rename Gladstone's building in Liverpool has been entirely focused on William Gladstone's commercial, economic, familial links to slave ownership, but entirely ignorant of his advocacy for British intervention in the American Civil War on behalf of the Confederacy. And that lets him off the hook. And Liverpool doesn't come out of this very well. Liverpool as a city campaigned for British intervention on behalf of the slave owners in the American Civil War. But by focusing on Gladstone's personal failings, the campaign edits out the real agents of historical change, which were the Lancashire mill workers who refused to handle slave-grown cotton and who opposed British intervention in the Civil War on the basis that the freedom of the black man and the establishment of liberty throughout the American continent represents the crowning pinnacle of freedom here in England. So I think that the current statue wars in Britain and in Northern Ireland do very little to disturb the comforting narratives of reconciliation and dialogue between different groups struggling for political power in the here and now, but they also erase and wipe out of history the real agents, the great social and political transformations that were achieved by mostly anonymous and forgotten men and women, millions of them, in Africa and Asia and in Europe and America. And I think that this happens because of this auditing of history, and because actually the narratives of history are being selected now to suit the political interests right in the here and now. So I'm against them because I want to see history recovered and reclaimed and to be brought back to life.
Very good. Thank you very much, Pauline. Well, very rounded series of talks. Thank you. Just coming quickly back on you, since it's only fair I ask you a question. I just wanted to find out why you think it's, or how it's happened. You know, this kind of moved from just a month or so ago, that kind of radical interventions of people on the street in their thousands. And yet today it's all gone quiet and it's been taken over by local authorities doing audits of statues within their environs. So how has that happened, and what is the process of what's happened?
Yeah, well, I think these sort of history wars have been a feature of politics now for a very long time. And I mean, I think it is helpful to look at Northern Ireland because they've been labouring with this for a very long time. And actually, the history wars, in a sense, have replaced the real, the actual war, which is probably a good thing, as some people would say. But it means that we don't have a real peace. We have a kind of a kind of uneasy peace, where the struggles and the differences are actually relocated to cultural and historical differences, which just can't be resolved, actually. But what happens there is that you get long periods of where it's quiet, where things go quiet, and then suddenly something happens and it all just erupts. And I think people might remember the flag protests that occurred in Northern Ireland in 2012. They just seem to come almost out of nowhere. And you get this sense that there's a sort of bubbling anger and frustration among people. And I think that I see that. And I don't actually deny the genuine anger and frustration that people have, in the sense that, that they're really frustrated and they want change. And I really get that. I just think that that this kind of focus on history and on statues in particular, that's such dead things, is really a distraction. I think, as I said before, it's kind of out of kilter with the times and what's needed today.
Okay, very good. Thank you all. Thank you very much. What I'm going to do, we're opening up the press the button thing. Participants, if you go on participants and click to raise your hand, there's a little blue hand which will appear. We can take some questions from the audience. But can I just quickly come to the panel? I mean, not that I have a million questions to ask you, but I just wondered whether any of you wanted to pick up on anything that other people had said to endorse or to criticize or to kind of bring out some points that you think may have been missed. I see Pippa her hand is raised, ever at the ready. Pippa, if you can unmute yourself.
Yeah, just very briefly to pick up on what Pauline said. It seems to me that one of the facets of recent times is that public policy has become steadily more complex. it's more difficult to grasp the range of things that happen. A lot of parts of public policy are so interconnected that whereas at one time you could see a very clear relationship between your fiscal relationship to the local or national state and what happened to you in terms of the social goods distributed to you, increasingly that doesn't feel like it's happening now. And understanding public policy, working through public policy, as someone who teaches public policy, it becomes really hard work. So I think to adopt a phrase from the province that Pauline looks at, it becomes very attractive to go for the easy argument of the Armalite rather than the hard graft of the ballot box, which is what people said as the peace process was going on in Northern Ireland. In the same way, going for the culture wars of going for statues or whatever becomes much more attractive than dealing with the hard problems like, let's sort out Grenfell Tower, as I preface my remark with, which is arguably more important to the real lived experience of individuals within our society now.
Cool. Pauline, do you want to come back on?
Yeah, I do. Yeah, and actually, Pippa, I absolutely agree with you there. I think that you know, you're dead right when you say that public policy has become messy and complex. And I think that actually, well, we've seen not just public policy, but public administration has kind of, you know, broken apart really, and there's no connections and things don't work and the levers don't work. And I think that this is in a way, there is a connection here that the policymakers and public institutions really have relied so much on kind of ideas and just sort of the politics of representation and identity, and have really actually lost the plot when it comes to the material world that we actually live in. And I do think that the kind of random nature sometimes, as it feels, of these eruptions that I was talking about of anger and frustration are that there aren't really solid political mechanisms that we can use to get, people talk about, you know, expressing ourselves democratically, but a lot of the stuff doesn't work. So I think that there is something in that, and I think this often is a lashing out actually, and that's not to demean it or belittle it in a way, but to say that people are rightly angry that society doesn't work in the way that it should do. And I think maybe it is a sort of taking it out on a sort of in a representational way, rather than actually tackling the real problems, which are much more difficult to sort out, perhaps the material problems that we need to grapple with.
Thanks. Any other comments? Patrick, please.
Yeah, sure. Just want to pick up on some of the points on about rewriting history. So I think, Pippa, you made some great points. A majority of them I actually support. I mean, we are fixated with statues, and the points I'm making about statues are not the be-all, end-all, because you know, by removing the statue, the history of that individual is still there, often reflected in national curriculum and other national narratives. What's interesting, over the last 10-15 years, you have like the National Trust, the Museum of Docklands and other museums who have gone through a process, and I've been involved in those processes of reinterpretation of their objects, their buildings, as a way of trying to explain to the public about the importance of the whole history, basically. And I think that's important. And so I'm not trying to say, I think people made the assumption that I wanted to get everything connected with slavery or the history of enslavement. I'm not saying that at all, because it's all around us. I mean, I've gone to different parts of Africa where you see all those slave forts, and they are most of them are UNESCO preserved buildings, because we need to let the public know, never again. No different to the whole stuff around the Holocaust and all the while we still have the Holocaust, those concentration camps, to remind the world it should never happen again, even though we haven't learned the lesson. But the difference between a place like Germany and UK, and even to US to extent, in Britain we've never had actual proper debate on the legacy of enslavement in Britain. So when you have the outpouring of the removal of Colston statue in Bristol, and people have used it mob rule, and I think I called it that, which is really disappointing the way he sees it, is because if we look at the democratic processes in Britain, you know, a recent report came out this week by Operation Black Vote and Green Park, highlighting the massive underrepresentation of people of colour in influence in the democratic process, in boardrooms, in local authorities, in the NHS. So, you know, where do you have that voice to show your concerns when the elite wants to reinforce the current narrative of history, celebrating basically empire? Ironically, yeah, people mentioned about the whole stuff around Grenfell is important. I actually agree with you. I was involved campaigning around the whole stuff around the Windsor scandal, and when the government commissioned a report by Wendy Williams, the Lessons Learnt Review, in one of the recommendations was that that Home Office officials and the government did not understand or did not know the history of empire, colonisation, and therefore what led to the causation of the Windsor scandal. So to me, the statue thing is one thing. I think it's actually the national curriculum. It's educating people as opposed to reinforcing stereotypes. And the final point, as I think was made quite clear by Pippa, is majority of these statues were done by private prescription. Only very few statues were funded by us as the taxpayer. Majority were there to glorify the past. So why can't we remove some of these statues, especially around enslavement, which glorify a certain past as well? Because their history is always going to be there, but it's about changing the curriculum and, more importantly, having new memorials. So one of the other memorial campaigns I'm involved in is the Windrush ship, the Empire Windrush ship. It's at the bottom of the Mediterranean Sea. It's been there over 50 odd years, and I'm working with a whole group of people to raise money to get the anchors, to use the anchors as a way of celebrating migration, identity, and the Windrush generation. We should be putting our energies into that than having these culture wars about old statues, which some of them we need to reflect on anyway. I'll stop there.
All right, thanks, Patrick. Ike, the gauntlet was thrown down to your language and your argument. Do you want to unmute yourself?
Unmute, sorry.
Yeah.
There we are. Just to come back on a couple of those points. Sorry, I respect everything Patrick said, but I am going to stand by my mob rule statement for the Edward Colston statue coming down. I'm not saying everybody who disagreed with the statue was a member of a mob, but the people who took it down, that was a mob. We've got to be honest about these things. It wasn't a democratic process. People didn't like it. They took it upon themselves to take it down. So I'm not going to kind of retract that, as it were. But some of the things I do agree with. I do agree with what Pippa and Pauline and Patrick said about there is a lack of democratic mechanisms whereby people feel they can be engaged with the process in order to have their view aired about who should be in the public space, who should be commemorated. And yet that kind of comes to a wider point about a problem with our democracy and a problem with engagement. So I completely understand that. And I also can see there's no point me banging on about saying these things should be decided democratically if there are no democratic mechanisms in place for people to have their views heard. So I think the two come hand in hand. That said, I will take respectfully slight issue with something Pippa said. Yes, I completely agree, has been said before, many of these statues were not erected democratically, but I don't think that's any reason for us not to try and want to kind of review them democratically now, or decide that we use democracy to decide what statues we want to commemorate or not in the public realm now. So I acknowledge, yes, democracy wasn't a part of how they were established, but I think we've changed now. It should be a part of how we decide what populates our public realm. And just finally, to Pauline, I went to Liverpool University and I was in Roscoe and Gladstone halls as well, to be honest. So I agree with what she said about the bizarreness of that campaign to change it. I can't say being in those halls ever made me feel victimized or oppressed, but it has surprised me the sheer level of energy and controversy that has gone into that debate in Liverpool, which I've watched from a distance down here in England. So I agree.
Thanks. Well, just to say that I don't know if you've been following this thing with the Cass Business School changing its name, which has been going on for quite a while, and they're just in the throes of doing it. But apparently, there's been alumni from the college are now threatening to sue because they say changing the name would devalue their qualifications that they've earned. You know, they say Cass has an international reputation, and maybe the Reid University might not have the same level of kudos. So there's to say there's two sides to a story is a bit trite, but I think it's an interesting addition to this conversation. Speaking of democracy and introductions into the conversation, this is one of the most fought after and argued over debates for a long time in British politics, and there's just one person with their hand up to make a point in this democratic arena. So can I encourage people just to kind of contribute and comment and make some statements? Thank you very much. There's more coming now. Okay, so we're taking hands. And so even though there's a couple of things out there still floating in the air, you know, Ike's comments on Pippa and what have you, you can come back. I'll take a couple of questions and then I'll come back to you as the panel. And you can answer and address any of those questions or none that you so desire. Yes, and I'll make a point. So if I can take Kevin Rooney, please, first up. I just unmute. Are you with us, Kevin? Here we go. Technical hitch.
Can you hear me now?
There you go. There you are, man. Yes, yes, indeed.
I generally agree with Ike and Pauline, but let me throw something out. If you take the southern states of USA, where lots of the statues of Confederates are being removed, or people want to remove them, from what I understand, the demographics in a lot of those states are changing in the sense that the majority of the population are black people, and those black people want those Confederate statues removed. So I know it's tempting to always sort of blame the white identitarians for the removal of the statues. My question to Ike and to Pauline is, what do you think about that? Secondly, Pauline, your PhD was on the question of Belfast and culture. My question is about the link between the material world and the cultural symbolic world. As a Catholic from Belfast, who's had statues imposed on us since the creation of the state of sectarian bigots and imperialist bigots, we walked across the Craigavon Bridge, named after the first Prime Minister of Northern Ireland, who boasted about not wanting to have a Catholic near him, or how we'd never employ a Catholic. The Reverend Rowan Hannah, I won't go on about all the names because the English audience won't know them, but everywhere you turn, there are bigots and sectarians and imperialists. There was nothing democratic about those statues put there. The vast majority of nationalist Catholics who happen to demographically be the majority in Belfast right now don't like those statues. Now, here's the rub and here's the dilemma. I know if Sinn Féin in the Belfast City Council started to remove those statues, the shit would hit the fan. It would be a disaster. I understand that, but do you understand the frustration of people like me and huge amounts of Catholics in Belfast who are caught between a rock and a hard place, who absolutely want to vomit at a lot of these statues and buildings and bridges, but realize that the response, once you start removing them, could lead to bigger problems? Discuss, help me, what do we do?
Thank you very much, Kevin. You have to let it go, Kevin. Peace process kicked in a long time ago. Good. Well, look, let me take a couple. We'll hold that thought. Yes, I know that's directed at Pauline directly, but I'm sure I saw Pippa nodding, and you all have views on this, I'm sure. Let me just take a couple more, if you don't mind. We have Richard Ings coming in, please.
Thanks, Austin. There's been a kind of couple of suggestions that you know, that it's a bit of a distraction, this whole thing about statues, and that there are more important things. And I wouldn't disagree with that. I think you could tear down all the statues that you might disagree with tomorrow, and it wouldn't have much impact on people's reaction to what's going on with coronavirus or the coming economic difficulties that will be associated with it. Nevertheless, it does seem to be the only game in town as far as, or at least one of the biggest games in town in terms of protests. So the question is, why on earth, or how on earth has that happened? A couple of years ago, when the Gilets jaunes in France first began their protests, a mob I would describe them a bunch of firebrands and hotheads, graffitied the Arc de Triomphe, which of course is a huge symbol of French imperial power, tried to put out the fire of the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, which is beneath it, got in, smashed busts of Marianne, which is the symbol of the French Revolution, found their way to the top and let off fireworks. The following week, a bunch of Gilets jaunes, more representative perhaps, surrounded the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier's fire and sang the Marseillaise to try and prevent people from doing that. If I had to, if I was asked the question, whose side would I be on, despite the fact that I'm a bit of an anti-imperialist at heart, I think I would definitely be on the side of the people who thought that there was something worth protecting about those symbols that had been created and that represented some kind of democracy, rather than the idiots, the vandals going in, graffitiing and smashing up the place. And I think I would apply that same logic to the people who did those things to the various statues around the country. And what I would say about them actually is that this has occurred to me, is that I think I would think of them as a bit imperialistic themselves. They seem to think that they can march in, take over the streets, much like the Occupy movement, much like the 99% or whatever they were called, Extinction Rebellion, occupy that space, colonize that space, and tell us all what we should be thinking and which statues we should be celebrating or not celebrating. And insofar as that is the case, you know, the fact that perhaps not many people wanted to contribute to this discussion, no disrespect, Austin, but it could be that the debate is genuinely elsewhere, and it is an attempt by idiots and vandals and hotheads and firebrands to dominate public space. No one wants them. Please go away.
Thank you very much. Some polemic in your language, I sensed there. Good. Let's just take one or two more. We have Rushab, please.
Hi there. I thought everyone had some really good points there. I found it really interesting about the Robert Jeffrey statue as well, which Patrick made a point about, because I signed that petition. I kind of opposed its removal, but I could understand why. And I received no follow-up. So it was interesting to see that the trustees had kind of reversed that democratic mandate, I guess in a similar way to how the merchant venturers had with the Colston statue and the popular will to do that. I also think it's interesting that some sources describe Robert Jeffrey as a shareholder in the Royal African Company, and others describe him as a slave ship owner. So I guess there needs to be some clarification when, I guess, appealing that decision, perhaps. What I want to suggest is maybe that this whole kind of culture war over statues is largely a waste of taxpayer money, because what tends to happen is that taxpayer money is used as I guess a bit of a PR exercise in order for councils to quote unquote virtue signal and show that they're doing something. And it seems to be a lot of, not exclusively, a lot of time it tends to be Labour councils, as we've seen with Tower Hamlets and their support of the removal of Robert Milligan, which the Mayor of London used as a photo op, and the renaming of Castellan Gardens in Hackney as well, which is again has been used, I guess, as you could argue as a PR exercise. And I don't remember there being democratic mandates for that. And arguably that money that was used to remove those statues or rename those public spaces could have been used to improve housing, transport and connectivity in some of the poorest parts of London. And I guess this, to go to a contemporary debate, I guess this could be applied to the Cecil Rhodes statue, which on the one hand, I think puts a huge amount on the fact that BAME individuals who see it, students, are grossly offended by it and can't understand perhaps that, you know, how BAME individuals have perhaps done quite well out of Rhodes' legacy, and the city council that wants to, is encouraging Oriel College to remove it without focusing on the wider issues in the city there. So yeah, that's what I had to add.
Very good. Thank you very much indeed. I'll just take one more and then I'll come back to the panelists, if you would, so you can comment on what's been said or criticize or however you want to take it. If I take Alka, please. you are there. Like
Thank you. Okay,
Thanks.
can you hear me?
Indeed.
Okay, I was very interested, I think, in something Pippa said, you know, that these, I mean, I can agree that this is not really about history. It does seem, when the debates happen, the intensity in which there are discussions about it are about what values and whose values are going to be the dominant ones to shape the narrative frame in which we understand today's experience. So in that sense, I would agree with, I think, Pippa's formulation. This is not really about history, and it's not history as such that is being erased. But I would ask, that doesn't mean to say I think history is in good shape as a discipline, if you like. And I would just, that brings me to the question that, which really touches on something Patrick said, which is that the go-to place for solving these problems is so often education and the curriculum. And there is a group at the moment quite influential in education, particularly history circles. So I'd be very interested to hear what Pippa in particular would say, called Justice to History. And, you know, their starting point is, what I'm concerned about here is for me, history is not just the list of names and dates. It is about trying to inculcate a sense of historical thinking, by which I mean we don't understand everything to be predetermined. Now, what this kind of group that's very influenced by the Black Lives Matter agenda are trying to do, and they're very explicit about it, is to solve today's problems in society through the history curriculum in particular. And I would like to know what people think of that, because to me there are two main problems with that, which is one, that it's undemocratic, because when you're talking about the curriculum, you're talking about people who are not equal citizens. You're talking about a younger generation and adults in a very specific educational situation, rather than the wider public sphere of politics. And secondly, I'm not so sure that that actually will do the task it seeks to do, which is to improve history. I think if your starting point is trying to solve contemporary political problems rather than questions or problems that sit within the discipline itself, then I think you're in danger of flattening historical thinking rather than developing it.
Very interesting. Thank you very much indeed. So thanks for all those contributions so far. If I can come back, anybody who wants to comment or add something or criticize what's being asked of them. There's been direct questions to Pauline on Belfast and the loyalist statuary, and there's also this conversation about whether we're reading history backwards within the history curricula, whether we're reinventing the past to suit the present. Directly to Pippa, but anybody else there?
I'm happy to come.
Okay.
I'm happy to come back.
Cool.
Yeah, I'll come back on obviously the direct question, because I think it also touches on maybe some of the other questions as well, particularly what Pink Richard was saying. First of all, I agree with Kevin there that, you know, the use of statuary in and monuments in Northern Ireland during the Unionist regime, and I think that's the correct way to describe it, before 1972, they used statues and memorials and symbols to infuse the public space with the public realm, with Protestant, British, Unionist imagery, and they did so in pursuit of a project which was based on discrimination, just systematic and structural discrimination against the minority there. They also, of course, ruled through special powers. They had a military, they had an armed police force and a kind of paramilitary police force, the B Specials. They were essentially a colonial government. And the Catholics of the North, as Kevin has said, withdrew actually largely to begin with, and just simply created their own separate sphere, cultural sphere, because they were excluded. And then they fought back, and through the civil rights movement, and also through an armed campaign for national rights. So all of this happened, and the landscape of Northern Ireland is completely transformed. It isn't any longer what was called the political slum, which existed pre-72. It is a completely transformed landscape. Now, so my answer to that is, I think that they were right. And actually they did blow up a number of monuments, I think, and deface them, and all sorts of violence was enacted on these monuments and these symbols of something that was very real, and it was an oppressive and disgusting regime, and it was rightly attacked. And in doing so, they changed the landscape, and they did so as part of a struggle of political and social transformation. I think if you were to say now, and I hear often people say they feel offended by flags today, and there was a great big uproar in 2012 because someone said they were offended by the Union flag flying in Belfast. I think that now is actually, I find that hard to take in good faith, to be honest. I think it shows a lack of tolerance, perhaps. And also, I think the question is, does it help? Does it help anybody, whether they're Unionists or Nationalists or Catholic Protestants? Does it really help to keep picking at the wounds of the past when actually, you know, why not just celebrate what people did to change that? So, I also think that there is a problem, that someone mentioned, of bad history, and also a kind of manipulation of history to kind of prove your point in the present. And I don't think that helps anyone either. So that's really my response to that for now.
Cool. In the corner of my eye, Kevin is urging to come back in, but I'm going to hold him back, I'm afraid. Anybody else there? I've lost sight of all the speakers. Pippa, are you pressing buttons? Just want to unmute the Pippa.
Yeah, I was pressing buttons because I was going to come back to the question which was directly addressed to me. Although there's a whole series of things to pick up on there. I mean, one observation is right from the use of statues in antiquity. Statues are about representations primarily of power. That's what Roman emperor statues are. They're placed at the limes of the empire to express that you are now entering power. That's why the British put statues all over the place, in order to express that they're holding power. That's why during the Jim Crow era, statues of Confederate soldiers are erected in the South to express the power imbalances which continue to be held there, which continue down to the present day in terms of the underrepresentation. Oh, you could talk about democracy, the underrepresentation of African Americans on the ballot paper, you know, on the voters register, all the deliberate attempts to keep them off the register, the way in which African Americans are still figured as violent within that society as a legacy of the violence done to them by the oppression of slavery, which of course was taken to that country by a people called the British. So power imbalances are represented in these statues, and you know, I feel for Kevin in how you deal with this. And of course, he's raised very eloquently the problem of, if you take those statues down in Belfast, will you make a difficult situation even worse, like the flags demonstration? And that's really the public policy question that needs to be addressed here. And there are various ways in which the British state tries to step round that. So from 1882 onwards, we have had statutory bodies who are responsible for maintaining what it is that is deemed historic, which ought to be officially maintained. The Colston statue was one. It was a Grade 2 listed monument, listed in 1977. Presumably the people who pulled it down were ignoring that. I'm told that about 40 listed monuments every year are destroyed, usually things like pubs and so on, very often by people deliberately accidentally backing lorries into them so they can claim on the insurance and so on. But so you may have an official realm of things which we are supposed to be preserving. It doesn't mean it necessarily gets preserved, even if it has the official imprimatur. And there's still the problem of whether this is democratic, which is where I come back to the question which was specifically posed to me. Just as historic England is a statutory body who determine what these things are. So you have statutory processes which determine what the curriculum are. Is that democratic? I have lots of problems with Michael Gove as the Secretary of State for Education. I have lots of problems with Michael Gove as a human being, probably. But I mean, the legacy of the way in which he deliberately bowdlerized history is every bit as offensive as any offence anyone might take to justice to history. The way in which he, I'm speaking as a co-chair of a primary school, we have to teach our students, quote, British values which are deemed by Michael Gove. And, you know, so what justice to history are trying to do is, it seems to me, get around some of the occlusion of history, some of the things which haven't been mentioned. And there's, you know, there is the old aphorism, history is always written by the victors. And history thereby occludes experiences. Not only that, but it also encodes these long-run views. So people in the States are still the prisoners of the history of slavery. You still have the tendency to read Africans and Americans as violent because of that history. You have enormous African American populations in America, in the prisons. You have an enormous African population, or black descended population in the prisons of Brazil, for exactly the same racialized reasons. They are the prisoners of a very unpleasant history.
Thank you very much. Okay, Ike, if you're in there, and Patrick, yeah, Ike, please.
I'll just briefly come back. Kevin did ask me, it's a very eloquent question, what I thought of the Confederacy statues coming down in the southern states, and I have no problem with that. Again, if it's done, you talked about the change in demographics and primarily black community. If it's done democratically, as I said, saying all along, I do not have a problem with that. As I said, I'm not aligned to keeping statues there for whatever reason all the time. If it can be taken down by a democratic process, then that's fine. I'd like to agree with what Richard Ing said. It always strikes me that the lack of self-awareness amongst many of the more militant people who want to kind of redefine public space or remove statues, etc., it is a new form of cultural imperialism. It's essentially saying that their opinion is worth more than anyone else's. And it's a form of arrogance, and it is a form of kind of dictatorial control that I think we should all resist. It's very anti-democratic. Yes, I've acknowledged already, we do need to improve the mechanisms to make sure that democratic expression can be realized, but I don't think anybody has the right to kind of impose their view on everybody else, particularly in something such as public space, which should be about kind of collective sense of citizenship, etc. I also agree with what Alka said. It's almost trying to weaponize history. There's all these debates about how much black history is taught, whether children get a fair representation of black contribution to British history. It's been a while since I was at school. I don't have school-age children, so it's not a debate I can fully engage with. But all I would say is that British history, if we're in Britain, British history is what's important. Black people contributed to British history. We don't have to subdivide it and call it black history. Black people contributed to everything Britain is today. So as long as that contribution is reflected, which I have no reason to believe from my understanding that it isn't, people like Rosa Parks, Mary C. Cole, those things I understand are part of the curriculum, and that should be the issue. It's not about segregating black history as some kind of special interest ghetto that only happens every October. It's an integral part of being British, and it should form part of the curriculum, which I believe it does to a degree already.
Thanks. We'll keep going on the argument, but we'll take Patrick in first, if you would. Is Patrick still around?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah,
so
sorry.
just respond to the last point made by Ike, which I found interesting about black British history, and it should be reflected. With all due respect, the only way that Mary C. Cole and other Equiano and some aspect of black and Asian history is included is down to educators, campaigners and activists, and direct action, including pulling down statues. That's been a history of changing this curriculum for many decades in Britain, to be quite honest. And the reason why is because we still have this narrow mindset in Britain that British history is a cross between Downton Abbey and EastEnders. It does not reflect the diversity, the intersectionality of Britain. And when you have the likes of Colston and in Jeffrey Museum, or the Museum of Home, and the memorial there, it's a proxy to a deeper debate, which I think people touched on. It's a deeper debate around structural racism and inequality in society. And therefore we fix our energies on those memorials, which reinforce that the historical representation, instead of exploring the wider issue. I said before, Britain has never had a proper reflection of its own history. Everyone's talking on this panel, and the questions in some of the chat rooms give the impression that the history of Britain has been a pure, nice history. It hasn't been. It's been a very bloodied history. Millions of people have died because of that history. And when we say we want to correct and reflect that, it's seen as weaponizing or being political correctness. We want the truth. We want to have the whole aspect of history. And you're quite right, people talk about the whole stuff around the Michael Gove project. He tried to get rid of Mary Seacole and the suffragettes, and any women actually, to be quite honest, to give a history of about dead white men. And that's not history. That's not British history. It's about the whole aspect of that. And luckily, you have to campaign. And the reason why there have been changes in the national curriculum and changes in public policy have been people campaigning, because the current systems and structures have not allowed that. They've tried to keep things down. And that's why it's important if we look at what's happened in America around the whole pulling down of Confederate memorials, basically, which, yes, there has, inverted commas, rob rule in a way, but actually most of those Confederate statues and memorials were deliberately placed in black communities to remind them who's in power. And that's why they've been pulled down. It was a deliberate act of oppression and reinforcing white supremacy in those deep racist southern states. And those statues have been pulled down bit by bit. And no one's been arrested, by the way, because they all know that those statues were there done illegally in the first place. Slightly different context in Britain. If we had plantations in Cornwall and in Devon and Northumberland, maybe we'll have a more proper debate and conversation, because unfortunately colonisation has happened in Africa, in the Caribbean and in Southeast Asia, out of sight, out of mind. And therefore when we have a debate like this, people always say, oh, it's different. No, it's the same. The empire, if you were born in India or born in the Caribbean, you were seen as British. And that's the reason why it's important to make sure that we have an inclusive history. And the final point I want to make is about the national curriculum. We need to change that for future. What sort of Britain do we want to have in the future? Do we want a Britain of the future which talks about 17th, 18th century racist slave traders who are still great people? Is that the kind of history, is that the kind of Britain that we want to have for the future? I don't think so. We should be changing that. If it means it's not about rewriting history, because you can't rewrite history, but what you can do is fill in the blanks of history.
Okay, thank you very much. Sorry to rush you there, Patrick. Look, I've got 4 hands shown, and you're going to have to be very quick, I think, and then we're going to come back to the panelists for, again, some short, sharp, kind of conclusive points. So can I take Sheila McNerney, please?
Hello, Austin. Just a couple of points and a couple of questions for the panel, if that's okay. So I think basically what we're saying is, who decides what we remember? It's clear that much remains forgotten. So in terms of everything that we're talking about, there is much that remains forgotten. But can we agree that the past was horrible? So I completely disagree with the idea that within this discussion, anybody thinks that history was nice. The past was horrible, and my immediate ancestors didn't actually want to remember it. So I take great pleasure in trying to forget my Irish heritage. I know the facts. I can tell you a lot about it. I can tell you the millions of people that died on the island. I can tell you why my family ended up in Liverpool. And I can tell you right now what the state of Liverpool is and what all of those statues mean. But I'm not really that interested in 100, 200 years ago. It's painful, it's despicable, and it sits in the past. I was interested in Pauline's point about Victoriana. And the fact is that many of these statues, I think Pippa also referenced this, many of these statues that we're actually looking at come out of a specific Victoriana period when individuals were memorialized. And I'm interested in the fact that the world wars turned into more general memorials. So there were so many people that were lost, so many heroic individuals that we couldn't even name them all. You know, the Mediterranean Sea is filled with shipwrecks and submarines full of individual people, but we don't remember them as individuals and put them on plinths. So bringing this to the present debate, I believe there's a deliberate, excessive showmanship to get headlines, a pretense about offence. But what we have on, the question I've got for the panel, if there's time, is what we have are leaders and corporations giving too much regard to the demonstrations. And I'm more interested in why we think leaders and corporations are embracing this current movement.
Thank you very much. This is the Irish statue debate, if you've joined in late. Thank you very much. Next we have Max Holloway, please. Are you there, Max?
Can you hear me?
Yes, indeed.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a couple of comments. First of all, I'm all for keeping the statues, unlike my friend Patrick. And I think that the reason I say that is because there's a serious argument, an intense argument of granularity of complicity about all this. And without keeping them there, we won't have the opportunity to actually append and bring things up to date and basically have a rational comment on what went on in the past. Now, I mean, for instance, I mean, I've suggested in Bristol, there's no reason why you can't have two people on that plinth with Colston and the figure that Marc Quinn put up there. So that, you know, I mean, what we need to look at here, we can do things with statues. Pauline made an interesting point about 1927, about the way that we look at statues. And a lot of people have this outmoded sort of like opinion of what statues actually do, right? Statues are memorials. Well, the thing is that they can do a lot more. We live in a digital age where augmented reality can actually tell stories through specific things in specific places. So we can also do that. So we actually have the option to do digital and physical translations of what we actually have now. And it's the arguments about that, I think, is why we need to have those particular things up there. Now, it's interesting, I don't know if people listened to the BBC4 programme recently about race and the public place, where it was a Samira Ahmed programme. And they had four very interesting people on there, and one of them was Neil McGregor. And McGregor was basically saying, he's a well-known historian, he was basically saying, and I'll quote him here, he says, "We want so that our history really does reflect where we now think of ourselves and the kind of society we want to be for the future." So in actual fact, we're talking about these people and, you know, oh, where's this person who did this and whatever. We're actually missing the point that the values and standards that we really should have in this country are not actually represented properly at the moment. And that is purely because the state doesn't want that, as people have quite rightly said. The state doesn't want it. The elite institutions only want to recognise you know, things like excellence and achievement and whatever. They're not talking about the real values of who we are and what we're actually about. You know, are we a country that, you know, we want to be multicultural or whatever? I mean, you know, all these things, we're not actually talking about the bigger picture.
Okay, I was going to congratulate you on being admirably concise, and then you made a second point, Mike. But thank you very much indeed, very much. Next we have Cheryl Hudson, please.
Hi, I was thinking that if we took the best arguments of the people who were arguing to remove the statues, they would say that they weren't trying to erase history, which is complicated and messy, but that they were trying to challenge the past and its mythologies And so there's a distinction to be made between history and the past. And the mythologies that they really want to challenge are those that are associated with the nation state in particular. And so British involvement with empire in the past, with the slave trade in the past, all of those kind of dark things which aren't included in the positive mythology about the nation state, they're arguing that these need to be kind of challenged and shown up through the discussion about statues. The problem is with that argument, and it's an argument that somebody like David Olusoga would make, right? So these are the kind of best arguments that are put forward. But the problem is that all of these arguments really assume that that kind of nation state mythology still has a lot of purchase today, that it still endures, and that the relationships remain the same, and so that there is no historical change. So in a sense, this attack on the statues isn't about the statues. I mean, I actually think that's completely fetishized, but it is about an erasure of history. It's about an erasure of the process of historical change and the way that meanings change through history. So it really is about a culture war of today. And it's about the creation of the erection of new myths that are being created for a new elite, a new emerging elite that are kind of consolidating their values and their morality. And so the kind of failure to recognize that the meanings have changed. I mean, I live in Liverpool, and there is a big controversy around Penny Lane, which I live right next door to. And Penny Lane, it was said that Penny Lane was named after James Penny, a slave trader. Now, actually, with Liverpool, you would actually have to take the entire city apart brick by brick if you wanted to remove any trace of slavery here. But so James Penny was seen as not only a slave trader, but somebody who argued, I mean, he was somebody who argued in a positive case for the benefits of slavery and the slave trade. So, you know, he isn't a good guy in history. And so, but of course, Penny Lane, when people talk about Penny Lane, mention it, they don't think of James Penny or the slave trade, because the meaning of Penny Lane was radically changed by the Beatles when Paul McCartney wrote that song, right? So everyone now associates that with the song. And so it takes a completely different meaning. When we're thinking about democracy and the meaning of the statues, the meaning of names, it's actually the democratic engagement with public space is things like that change of meaning for Penny Lane, that it doesn't mean for the public in Liverpool what it may have meant in the past. Now, it's actually being contested that it even meant that it was even named after James Penny, but this is because the council are now doing a review of all the names of the roads in Liverpool and thinking we need to remove all the slave traders. But then they realized, oh crumbs, that might mean we'd have to change the name of Penny Lane, which now brings in a lot of money for the, you know, with the tourists who come to look at Penny Lane because of the song. And so they've now put a lot of money into researching and to try to find an alternative history of Penny Lane, so that it was named something else. So, you know, it isn't really about history. This is about the values of the present and a kind of consolidation of a new kind of regime. And I just want one final thing is just on the Confederacy. Very good. Very quickly, it's just on the Confederacy. I really contest the argument that the Confederate statues were put up to keep blacks down. The Confederate statues were, the meaning of them, they weren't put up during the Confederacy, they weren't put up during Reconstruction, they were put up at the end of the 19th century as part of the process of national unification. And it was the way that the new South, the emerging kind of South, kind of sugarcoated for Southerners the encroachment of market relations into the South and the kind of a new kind of way of doing things. So it was much broader than a kind of racist attack on black. In the 1960s, different kettle of fish. Anyway, so
sorry, we have to stop. We've got very little time. We've actually run over. I just wanted very quickly. I wanted to say that one wag has put up the idea that you should take down the Penny Lane sign, which is reflecting on James Penny, and put up another sign, Penny Lane, which would be named after the Beatles song, and that would clarify things. Can I just take the next speaker? And again, we have to be very, very quick if you can, please, which is Maren Tom.
Yes, trying to be very quick, especially since Cheryl probably made my point for me much more eloquently. But so what I can see is that there's two different things going on. First of all, you have got this weird acting out against statues by a neurotic mob, which is probably not about statues at all, because as Pippa said, this is not how we relate to history. But why do they choose history as this neurotic acting out? Why is that the thing? And we can see, again, I agree with Pippa here, that there's a postmodern element of how I understand we relate to history, and history's gone, it's in the past. We only have the way we relate to this, and this relates to Alka's point a little bit, in that what has changed is how historical thinking influences contemporary neurosis, so to speak. So what we have now is this emphasis on understanding history through suffering. You know, the more people suffered, this is how we interpret history today. Why is that how we relate to history today? Why is this so important? This leads to these kind of very, very problematic assumptions of comparing the transatlantic slave trade to the Holocaust. It's about, yes, it's about suffering. If you see history through suffering, you can compare this, but I think this is a really, really dangerous, problematic way of understanding history.
Okay.
So here we go, and so what's the relationship between our understanding of history and the kind of contemporary neurosis today? Where do these fit together?
Thank you very much, Maren. And that brings it back to Patrick as well, starting off that whole comparison with the Holocaust, so we can round it off. Final point, and it has to be very, very quick, Alka. You're getting a second bite to come back on this issue. Alka, are you there? I'll give you 2, 3.
Here.
Oh,
I'm here.
Okay.
Thank you. I'll be really quick. Michael Gove just brings out the absolute blind spots in people. I mean, I'm not a huge fan of his, but he revised the history curriculum, and he actually put on non-European histories as one of the options that people could study. And if it's not being studied as much as some people would like, or in the way that some people would like, I don't think we can automatically assume that was, you know, in teaching and education a race, right? Not the way.
Okay, Alka,
I'm
afraid.
quite concerned. You know, we hear all these phrases. You're going to have to. Can I just finish my one point? If you get obsessed with trying to make a school subject address political problems today, you will end up distorting the truth value, and that really isn't going to be good for anybody.
Grant, all right. I apologize about that. Your signal was just disappearing a little bit. Okay, look, we've run over time. I'm going to just come back to the speakers, if you don't mind, in the same order in which you spoke, just to kind of give a rounding off, maybe 1 minute or 2 minutes. Please try and keep it tight. It's my own fault for overrunning, so I apologize. But Patrick, do you want to come back on anything?
Yeah, sure. I'll keep it very brief. And it's been a good debate, everyone. Even though I don't agree with all the points, but it's cool. We're here. So very briefly, people keep on saying time and time again, it happened in the past, move on, get a life. I'm sorry, that's not acceptable. In 2015, we paid the last amount of money in debts that we borrowed to pay for the compensation of the slave traders that received the money in 1833, whereas my ancestors got diddly squat. And the reason why is because our history, our lived historical experience has never been valued, never been recognized, and therefore we are told, move on, get a life. And that is why statues that's why in many ways the mob moved down the statue of Colston, because it reflected the anger, 400 years of anger of not recognizing our history. A couple of years ago, I was involved with the Peer Society where we had a conversation about comparing the Holocaust and the transatlantic slave trade. And and there were Jewish scholars and academics, and a number of us shared our experiences. And we came to the same conclusion. We recognized that the Holocaust and the transatlantic slave trade was perpetrated by Europeans. And that is, secondly, there's a mythology that it's Gentiles that save Jewish people during the Holocaust, and we would depend on William Wilberforce to save us, not recognizing the acts of resistance that took place during the Holocaust and during slavery. And also we recognize also that whereas when after the Holocaust, Germany had to pay reparations, along with Japan, had to pay reparations for what it did. And there was a whole process of memorialization and recognition of this. Where when they come to the Black or African descent experience around enslavement, no reparations, no acknowledgement, no apology, and no efforts to rectify that past. And that is why we will still fight to make sure that the national curriculum reflects that history. And the reason why we still have Black History Month, sadly, is because if we don't have it, then you won't talk about our history. Full stop. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Patrick. Very forceful. Ike, if you would please keep it tight. Are you there, Ike?
Oh, sorry. Thanks for the conversation. I've enjoyed it as well, even though obviously we disagree. But this is great. Debate should be about intelligent conversation and kind of respectful disagreement. Just to kind of conclude, I suppose my primary objective, from I suppose an architectural point of view, is that public spaces should be unifying. Not everybody's always going to agree with every facet of public space or every statue that's erected there, but if at least they can't be unifying, they shouldn't be used to enforce or entrench division. And that's why I think the kind of removal of statues from a kind of unilateral kind of minority, if you like, point of view is not the way to do it. Obviously, I get the anger, I understand it, obviously I disagree with some of what Patrick said, but the slave trade was awful, it was abysmal, it was a terrible stain on not just British history, global history. Slave trade happened not just in Britain or the West, happened across Asia, across the Far East. It was an awful time. But I don't think we should unilaterally allow that to define our experiences today. We live in a completely different world. It's up to us as Black people or as anybody to reclaim our own opportunities and make the best of our own lives. And this is why, to a degree, I have issues with these kind of terms like BAME or Black community. What Patrick and I are examples of today. We disagree on many points, but we're both Black. There's no way you can kind of categorize everybody just on the basis of their color, saying that we think the same, eat the same, talk the same. It's not true. We're as diverse as anybody else. And that should also be reflected in public space by not having statues like Edward Colston coming down, supposedly representing the whole Black community, because it doesn't. Whereas individual, whereas allowed to have as different opinions as everybody else. So my final call would be for public spaces to, where possible, to be used to unify people and to be used for expressions, collective expressions of democratic will, even if it means that we have to improve the mechanisms whereby people can have their democratic thoughts read and realized and expressed.
Right, thank you very much, Ike. So even though keep it tight, you still go on. And now we have Pippa, who I can just only imagine will speak for slightly more than a minute.
A couple of points. Firstly, I want to talk about public space and I want to talk about history. Public space is something we would like to see as democratic, but it's not. For most of history, public space is owned and occupied by elites and run by elites for their own purposes. So whilst it might be nice to listen to what Mike's just been talking about, doesn't mean it's true. Secondly, in terms of history, I would argue that there is no truth. There are truths in history, but it depends on whose history you're telling. So the truth that Michael Gove wishes to tell is a particular truth, but it still involves writing out of history an awful lot of things. In 2018, the Indian diplomat and historian Shastri Tharar spoke in Oxford, and he was asked, well, what do you think about the British giving reparations to India? And he said, well, the British couldn't afford it. But what you could do is teach people about what the British did to India more. And at the moment, that is by and large occluded from the curriculum. Just having odd bits and pieces is nice, but it also runs the risk of being tokenistic. We need to bear in mind, history is always a dialogue between the present and the past. It is not a truth about that past. It's about how we interpret that past to the present, and where statues come into that is how we interpret what those statues represent or seek to distort the representation of when it comes to that past.
Pippa, thank you very much indeed. That was perfect. Let's just finally take Pauline to round it off, please.
Okay, I wanted to come back to say that I think it was a really interesting points made about the way that the contemporary public space is actually sort of reverting back. It was a point that I tried to make, and other people made it, I think, very eloquently, reverting back to that old public space. It's almost like a sort of imperialism in reverse in a way, where we had a sense of public space which has been shaped during the democratic era to reflect a kind of idea of a democratic or of a public. We're now seeing it as a sort of battleground for different attempts to sort of stamp a kind of different historical narratives onto public space. And I also think that politicians and public figures are really have to watch them, because actually they take these negative histories and this kind of histories of shameful, dark histories, and they use them to enhance their own self-image and to consolidate their power in public life. And I talked about it before, and I really think they have to be watched there. And the other thing is that finally, people have talked about history and education, and I absolutely agree. I think it's really important. But I think somebody said, and it might have been Sheila or Alka, that if you take history and put it to the service, yes, it's a dialogue between past and present, but if you twist it and mold it to the service of political agendas, then I think you're going to get distortions and gaps and occlusions, just as you have done throughout history. And I would actually ask if we could just teach history. And if we taught history, we would know about what I mentioned before about the role of the Lancashire mill workers. Like to say another, I'd like a statue to them. I'd like a statue to honour their contribution. They brought about, or they saved, as Karl Marx wrote, they saved the ruling class of England and Europe from the criminal folly of plunging headlong into the perpetuation of slavery in America. And they did that because they stood up against the British intervention in the Civil War on the side of the slave owners. And they did it at great cost and great pain and great hardship to themselves over 2 years of during the cotton famine. And I would just ask people to read about that, find out about that piece of history, and ask yourself, why is that not being celebrated? Why don't we hear about those dead white men and women who actually were part of an international and global struggle, not just for their own rights, but for the rights of all working people all over the world? So with that note.
Thank you very much indeed. At this point, I would normally like to intervene and give you my viewpoint, but since there's got 4 similar but yet varied contributions from the panelists, it would be an indulgence. I mean, again, I'm not averse to an indulgence, by the way, but I think it might be trampling over all the nuances of what everyone said, so thank you all for that. Secondly, the only thing I would raise is when Pippa talked about public space, it's an ideal, yet it doesn't exist. I mean, obviously, one cannot but agree with that, but it's almost a bit like the Chinese when they talk about democracy. It's a nice idea, but it doesn't exist. And then they say, therefore, maybe we should go with our model. Just authoritarianism lurks sometimes in these conversations. But I think that what has been said has been a fantastic eye-opener to a wider conversation on education, on Irish history. You name it, it's all been in there. And my parting shot would be that I would like to see a statue raised to all 4 of you for your heroic efforts in this conversation. May that be crowdfunded starting now. So can we unmute and have a rousing round of applause for our speakers, please?